Alright folks, this is our first review session that's going to entirely dedicate itself to argumentative essays. The focus today is to see what earns a 6 out of 6 on the AP Lang's rubric, and hopefully by the end you are aware of what makes that 6 in terms of your writing, in terms of how you review your work, in terms of how you just look at your writing and think to yourself, yeah, for sure, that's a 6. A lot of students, when they walk into the AP exam, think they earn like a 4, a 5, or whatever, but the entire process of it is you have two readers who basically debate whether or not you score a 3 or a 4 or 5 or 6, and until they reach consensus, they won't give you a score. So in the image here, if both readers, for example, think it's a 3, you score a 3 on that particular essay. Or if they score 4 and 3, they would have to debate whether it's a 4 or 3. So in this case, how do you kind of get into the mindset of a reader and then later know for sure definitively you probably wrote a 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever, right? So we'll go through the first few slides. It's kind of a long presentation if you look at it from the Google Drive itself. So I'll go through the first 13 slides or so in terms of getting to the thesis done, and then later I'll continue the rest in the second video here, because it's going to be a doozy then if it's all just packed into one. So just to kind of keep awareness of the drive itself, it's going to be updated on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays in terms of materials that we're focusing on for the actual class itself. So if you look at the drive right now, you have the first presentation that I put in, but you also have the new stuff that you'll be working on if you so choose to do so for this Monday process. So you have the presentation that we're looking at right now. It's called Review 1 Arguments. You have a reading called Not Going to College. You have a sheet called Practice Work 1, which is kind of like all the work that you would be doing if it was class, for example, and then later editorials to analyze called Student Editorials. So basically, I'll just mention per presentation what materials are put into the drive so you can look at it while you're doing the work there. So without further ado, I want to focus on just kind of going back to bare basics, right? Because it's all about logos, ethos, and pathos. And even though for rhetorical analysis, you're looking for what an author does for these three elements here, what you need to think about is how can you outline your essay to include it now yourself, right? Ethos being like your intelligence, your trustworthiness, your morals. It could be yours, it could be somebody else's, but basically your credibility. Why do I have to listen to you? How do you actually sound like someone worth listening to? Do you have a strong style? Do you have good vocabulary? Is your syntax clear? Do you have any experience that basically adds to this particular argument? We need to consider all those things. Or if not, then later at least bring in some people who are credible regarding the situation, right? It's all about belief when we talk about arguments. Logos, your evidence, your data, your universal truths. So in this case here, whatever is good reasoning, right, to guide us through in a factual or at least a method of deductive or inductive reasoning to basically prove to me that, yeah, intellectually this is correct. But at the same time, can you hit my heartstrings a little bit, your emotions, your prejudices, your motivations? Can you understand your audience to basically persuade them on a human level? And while it's a little bit irrational, perhaps, it is one that is more engaging or more powerful, things that activate us on a more, almost spiritual level. So consider this when you're writing your argumentative essays. Overuse is bad. If you rely too much on pathos, rely too much on ethos or logos, you're going to have a very weak essay. So if you're all pathos, basically you're talking about the work being too subjective, or you lack reasoning and facts. And even though you're being emotional, not every audience is going to sadly be touched, right? So if you talk about, for example, how prisoners are on death row and that's inhumane, well, there might be someone who thinks to themselves, well, I don't care. Actually, yeah, they should be on death row because they committed a huge felony. So in this case, pathos is risky because not everyone shares your same pathos. If you're writing a piece that's all ethos or majorly ethos, then you're writing without substance, because in this case, you're relying entirely on other people. So ethos is dangerous because even though you want to bring experts and so forth in, or you want to write in a very authoritative way, at a certain point, it's kind of like, okay, well, what about your own reasoning, or what about some actual evidence? If you're lacking that, it does start to lose its momentum and power. Logos is tricky because even though it's the most definitive in terms of an argument, it's also the one that people might stem away from if it's not used correctly. So in this case, if you just throw a bunch of facts and reasons down, question is, okay, but what's the purpose, right? What's the purpose of all this information? What do you want me to think or feel, whatever? It lacks guidance in that case. At the same time, all logos is callous, meaning that it's too inhumane, where let's say that you make, I don't know, back to death row content or comments, You argue that death row people have broken XYZ law, therefore all of them should be sent to jail awaiting their execution. It's kind of like, oh, whoa, what about this kid who, in self-defense, killed his molesting father? And it's kind of like, no, he broke the law, he must die. And it's like, what? No exceptions? So logos sometimes is perhaps a little bit too inhumane, or it takes away all exceptions, right? And sometimes there are exceptions because context is needed. So in this case, just be very conscious of the types of evidence you're using. Balance the three together in your essays here. So here's what the rubric asks for. Is we're going to look at just the first part here about thesis, right? Because it's either you get a point or you don't. So this is actually the same in-class rubric that I use. I basically condensed what the AP one was asking for, and it kind of goes down to these two categories here. Things that don't earn the points and things that do earn the point. So if you want to earn the point, you don't do the middle column here. You don't restate the prompt. So even though they give you a prompt question, you don't want to just reword it word for word. It's kind of basic that way. If you don't take a position, or your position is vague or must be inferred. So we want to be as clear as possible. I'm just going to keep using the same example because we've been talking about it, the death row one. If you argue, quote unquote, if you say that death row inmates, although have done wrong, society may deserve another chance, but it's entirely decided to the audience. And it's kind of like, what? Yeah, I can see where your mindset's going, but what's the stance that you have? Do they get killed or not? That's the question, right? Well, okay. Are they going to be put for execution or not? What's your reasoning? Go. That's what they're asking for. Take a position. Make sure it's clear. Don't make us have to do any inference work here. And third item here, state an obvious fact rather than making a claim that requires a defense. You want to be careful with your thesis because sometimes you're thinking like, I will put something that everyone agrees with. No, that's not the point. The point is to make something that's argumentative, something that we could debate. So in this case, you might argue, while death row inmates are awaiting death, we can still make the process to their day of execution or their day by day more humane by treating them as humans. I don't know. It's up to you, right? Something that's more factored based, or something that's kind of like a addendum, or something that's like more of a caveat. Basically what I'm saying is something that we can kind of have a discussion regarding the topic here. Because if you just write, people who are on death row are going to be executed, it's kind of like, yeah, that's the point. That's what the name says. Death row, it's not vacation row. So just be careful with how you form your thesis. It has to be worded correctly. Now, it's just one category in terms of how you earn this point. Respond to the prompt rather than restate or rephrase the prompt, and the thesis clearly takes a position rather than just stating that there are pros and cons. So basically kind of like everything opposite of what we mentioned in the middle column, right? You're responding to the prompt as if you're a regular human having a conversation. You're taking a position, and it's something that is just kind of like more on it discussion based, like you can have an argument on, rather than the fact that just stating that there are pros and cons, like that there are two sides to every coin. Yeah, we know that. It's the point. So let's talk about thesis, because thesis is kind of tricky for some people. After this, hopefully you can make a thesis perfect, or it's something that you have no questions about 10 out of 10 times. There's 5 steps to make a good thesis. It has to be debatable, it has to be assertive, it has to be reasonable, it has to be evidence-based, it has to be focused. So we'll talk about each of these categories here, and then you're going to do some exercises later for the classwork in terms of how to make each one basically apply to your own thesis here. If you look at this picture here, this guy says, money is bad because it is green. Okay? What's your point, right? That seems to be 1, a fallacy. 2, what do you mean by bad? 3, why is green? You know what I mean? Like there's so many open factors, and they're making a claim of some sort, but it's not a good thesis. So we have to be careful with like our assumptions, our subjectivity, and all that. We can't just put that into our writing here. So let's talk about the first part, debatable. We have to make sure that we can actually have a back and forth discussion, agree, disagree. So I'll give you, for these next 5 slides, the sort of what not to do versus what to do, so you can consider what your thesis statement should include. So let's talk about junk food in this case here. Sample, junk food is bad for your health. That's not debatable. We can all agree for the most part that junk food is bad for your health, but we still eat it. You know what I mean? So in this case here, the first part is not debatable. It's a bad thesis. Second part, look a little bit underneath here. Because junk food is bad for your health, the size of sodas offered at fast food restaurants should be regulated by the federal government. Okay, here we go. Thesis. It's debatable because we can agree, disagree, and it's also very specific in terms of what this author wants us to focus on or do or consider. So the first part is, all right, we already know that fast food is bad for your health, but let's talk about size then. Let's talk about size of soda, something very specific, and at fast food places specifically, and that it should be regulated by federal government. So there's a ton of stuff in here that we can argue on. We can look at federal government, its role. We can talk about fast food restaurants as a corporation. We can talk even just about soda as a factor. Boom, there's 3 paragraphs right there, and that makes it that much more debatable than the first one there. So in your thesis, you have to ask the question, can people agree or disagree with my thesis? If they can't, then it's just a fact or a common sense thing. It's not worth putting in. Your thesis has to be assertive. It has to actually assert a position. So let's look at the first example here. Federal immigration law is a tough issue about which many people disagree. Okay? Sounds like a fact again, or it sounds like an observation you're making, but so what, right? What's your stance on this here? Let's look at the second one. Federal immigration enforcement law needs to be overhauled because it puts undue restraints or constraints on state and local police. Got some big words in here. The real big one is the verb, it needs to be. That's a stance right there. That's being assertive. You can't just be like maybe or perhaps. No. It needs to or it doesn't. In this case, you want to make sure you put your foot down and you choose a side here. That's the tricky thing about argumentative essays. Even if you're like 51% versus 49, pick the 51%. You have to argue a particular stance here. You can offer concessions and counter arguments and all that, but you need to make sure you're very decisive. So in this case, it asserts a position that immigration enforcement law needs to be changed. And it even gives some reasons because it puts undue constraints on state and local police. So your thesis also wants to give a little bit of rationale that guides us through. It's not just random, right? Now for your class of 21, I want to talk about verbs real quick because if you look at the previous slide, going back real quick here, the big one is needs. This is the entire dictation for the thesis here because it relies on a verb. And I want you to consider this as verbs for thesis because it will dictate your entire argument and your stance and all that. So here's why verbs are important. So this guy here, Satoshi Tajiri, he's the guy who created the Pokemon franchise. He's the guy who you are themed for Fantastics, should you still have it, but that's besides the point. But basically Tajiri in 1990s, he was thinking like, oh, a lot of video games right now have a lot of good verbs, right? Like shoot or kill or fight or whatever, right? And the games revolve all around those verbs. If you think about it, even today, video games that you play all revolve around particular verbs. So, if you're playing a shooter, for example, it's the verb of working together, shooting, being accurate, whatever, right? And for Tajiri, he thought, what about catch? Because Pokemon's all about catching these little pocket monsters and then later fighting against other people. Fighting was kind of a thing that we saw already, but what about catching? Going around the world and actually, harnessing the power of all these small things. So my point here today is this, that dictated an entire franchise of games here. And for Tajiri, his argument is the next big verb will be the next big game that comes out. And so whatever verb that you choose is super important because it dictates the next big action that we're focusing on. So if you think about your verbs in an essay here, if you look at like rhetorical analysis, it's a bigger role there because you're thinking about what the author's doing, the author's verb. Is Steinbeck arguing? Is he shaming? Is he exposing? Is he revealing? States kind of weak because if you say like Steinbeck states, it's just kind of like him, what did he write here? Basically, he's not really doing anything with the text per se. Steinbeck criticizes. These are the things that you want to use instead of just says or the text says or whatever. You want to be very conscious of the verb that you're using here. Everything being written is doing something. It's having a verb to it. So same with your thesis statement. Make sure your thesis statement has a very clear verb to it. Make sure your thesis is reasonable. First example, city council's members stink and should be thrown in jail. That's too subjective, you know what I mean? Because just because they're ineffective doesn't mean they should be sent to jail. There are other protocols to follow. So in this case, this one relies entirely on pathos. Thesis is weak because it's entirely on my feelings. Second one, city council members should be term limited to prevent one group or party from maintaining control indefinitely. That sounds more reasonable to me. It sounds like something that is more legislative. It sounds like something that follows protocol here. Term limit, maintaining control indefinitely. Again, it gives me a reason. It gives me something to be reasonable about. It's arguable because sharing political control is a reasonable goal. It has to be evidence-based. It has to be something that leads to an essay that can be defended with various types of evidences, not even just facts and statistics. It can also be supported with anecdotes and all that. Example number 1. Individuals convicted of murder will go to hell when they die. What? That's not even reasonable either, right? It's not evidence-based because all the evidence for that one is religious. So in this case, you can't use this one here. It's entirely subjective or based off of an opinion. Second one. Rehabilitation programs for individuals serving life sentences should be funded because these programs reduce violence within prisons. Okay, that sounds a lot more reasonable and evidence-based because I can prove a couple of things in the evidence here. I can look at rehab programs. I can look at it serving specifically those in life sentences. I can look at the fact that they should be funded and that these programs reduce violence within prisons. So there's two big things I'm considering here. How much does it show that the funding reduces violence in prisons? Boom. That's all the evidence I need, or the main focus of my evidence in this case. So when you're making a thesis, just make sure it's evidence-based. And the last one, make sure it's focused. Make sure that there's an actual goal to it. Make sure that it has specific boundaries to it. So look at this example here. The federal government should overhaul the U.S. tax code. Why? You know what I mean? There's no reason to it. And there's a couple of more questions that go with it. What part of the government, right? What division? What tax codes? There's a bunch of them. What sections of these tax codes? This is super broad. So in this case here, whatever you're talking about usually is a little bit more nuanced than you think. So you want to make sure that all the factors, all the criteria of your argument are as specific as possible when you're making that argument there. So we're talking about social media, for example, in the last prompt that we're doing for the argumentative essay. Well, social media. A couple of people in 6th period, when they're talking about their transition sentences and all that, they mention very specific brands of social media or apps of social media. So in this case, your thesis wants to be a little bit more fleshed out and focused when making your points. Better example in the second part here. The U.S. House of Representatives, okay, that part of the federal government, should vote to repeal the federal estate tax, okay, a specific tax, because the revenue generated by that tax is negligible. Boom. Gives a reason as well, a stance that this tax is negligible. We can prove that. We can focus on that. We can find evidence for that. It's focused into it. It has all the criteria I'm looking for in a thesis. So when you're making a thesis statement, you want to make sure all these 5 criteria are put in place. And so I got 2 prompts from the AP exam that I'm going to test you with. See how well you can put this, lesson into play. There's 2 prompts. I want you to, in your shortest time possible, 3 to 5 minutes, depending on which one you choose, can you make a thesis that includes all the factors of being focused, of being evidence-based, of being reasonable, of being assertive, of being debatable? Can you have all these things in there and later figuring out whether it works or not? So this is the first part of the video. Second part is going to focus next on evidence and also sophistication, just because thesis statements just take that long.